Words have power. Have you ever thought about how certain phrases can reveal hidden truths about who says them? According to Carl Jung, language is a window into the collective unconscious, revealing patterns that have been repeating in human relationships for millennia. When someone says certain things to you, they aren't just words, they're ancestral warning signs that your intuition recognizes even before your conscious mind processes them. In this video, we'll explore 5 seemingly common phrases that, according to Jungian psychology, reveal dark patterns that should make you walk away immediately. These expressions are linguistic masks for deeply rooted toxic behaviors in the unconscious. Are you ready to never hear these phrases the same way again? Do whatever you want. When someone tells you to do whatever you want, it might seem like they're giving you freedom and autonomy. However, from a Jungian perspective, this phrase often reveals something much deeper and more concerning, a pattern of emotional abandonment disguised as permissiveness. Carl Jung believed that our relationships are deeply influenced by unconscious patterns. When someone repeatedly uses the phrase, "do whatever you want," they're often disengaging from the responsibility that comes with genuine connection. This isn't about granting freedom. It's about withdrawing emotional investment. The statement represents what Jung would call a shadow projection. The speaker may be struggling with their own fear of commitment or responsibility, projecting it outward by creating emotional distance. Rather than engaging in the healthy tension that exists in relationships, the balance between independence and togetherness, they're essentially stepping back from the relationship entirely. This phrase can be particularly damaging because it creates confusion. On the surface, it appears to offer freedom, but the underlying message is one of indifference. The person is saying, "I don't care enough to engage with your decision or its impact on our relationship." This creates what Jung would call a double bind, a situation where no matter what you choose, you lose the emotional connection. From a psychological standpoint, this phrase often emerges from individuals who experienced emotional neglect in their formative years. They learned that detachment was safer than engagement. When they say, "do whatever you want," they're unconsciously recreating the emotional unavailability they experienced earlier in life. In the collective unconscious that Jung described, this pattern relates to the archetype of abandonment. Throughout human history, being cast out from the tribe meant death. When someone communicates indifference to your choices, it triggers a primal fear of abandonment. Your unconscious recognizes this threat long before your conscious mind does. The statement also represents what Jung called passive aggression, expressing hostility through apparent permissiveness. The person isn't directly confronting issues in the relationship, but is instead retreating from engagement while making it seem like they're being generous or accommodating. What makes this phrase particularly insidious is that it places the burden of the relationship entirely on your shoulders. You become responsible not only for your decision, but also for maintaining the emotional connection that the other person has abandoned. This creates an imbalance that Jung would identify as unhealthy for psychological well-being. The healthier alternative would involve what Jung called individuation within relationship, the process of becoming your full self while remaining in authentic connection with others. Instead of saying, "do whatever you want," a psychologically healthy person might say, "I have my preferences, but I respect your autonomy. Let's talk about how your choice might affect us both." Jung observed that meaningful relationships require both parties to be fully present and engaged. When someone consistently uses phrases like, "do whatever you want," they're signaling an unwillingness to engage in this process. They're choosing emotional absence over presence. This phrase often appears during conflict, when engagement would require vulnerability. By saying, "do whatever you want," the person avoids having to expose their own needs, fears, or desires. They're protecting their ego at the expense of genuine connection. In many cases, this statement is a form of what Jung would call emotional manipulation, a way to make you feel guilty for your choices while the person maintains plausible deniability. If you make a choice they don't like, they can later claim, "Well, I told you to do whatever you wanted," shifting blame entirely to you. The person using this phrase may also be engaging in what Jung called compensation, trying to appear detached and indifferent to mask how much they actually care. This often stems from fear of rejection. By appearing indifferent first, they protect themselves from the pain of caring more than the other person. When examining relationships through Jung's concept of the anima and animus, the feminine and masculine aspects within each person, this phrase represents a failure to integrate these complementary energies. It's a retreat into false independence rather than embracing the interdependence that healthy relationships require. Jung believed that our words reveal hidden aspects of our psyche. When someone habitually says, "Do whatever you want," they're revealing an undeveloped capacity for intimate connection. They're showing you a part of themselves that's afraid of true engagement. This pattern becomes particularly problematic in long-term relationships. Over time, consistent emotional abandonment creates what Jung would call psychological isolation, a state where you feel alone, even when physically together. This isolation can be more damaging than actual separation because it creates constant uncertainty. From an archetypal perspective, the person who frequently says, "Do whatever you want," is often playing out the role of the absent authority, someone who has power in the relationship but refuses to use it constructively. Instead, they create a vacuum that leads to anxiety and insecurity. The phrase also represents a failure to engage with what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to find creative solutions that honor both parties' needs. By refusing to engage, the person blocks the possibility of growth and transformation in the relationship. People who regularly use this phrase often struggle with emotional intimacy. According to Jung, true intimacy requires both vulnerability and boundaries. By saying "do whatever you want," they're avoiding both, refusing to set clear boundaries while also refusing to be vulnerable about their own needs. This statement can also reflect what Jung called inflation, an exaggerated sense of one's independence. The person may believe they don't need emotional connection, failing to recognize their own relational needs. This inflation eventually leads to psychological deflation when their unacknowledged needs aren't met. When confronted about this behavior, the person might deflect responsibility by claiming they're simply being respectful of your autonomy. However, Jung would point out that respect involves engagement, not withdrawal. True respect means caring enough to remain involved in the relationship, even when difficult feelings arise. According to Jung's understanding of psychological development, mature relationships involve what he called conscious relatedness, being fully aware of how we affect each other. The phrase, "do whatever you want," represents an unconscious attempt to escape this awareness and the responsibility it entails. In Jungian analysis, recurring patterns like this are opportunities for growth. If you find yourself repeatedly involved with people who emotionally disconnect with phrases like "do whatever you want," it may be time to examine your own relationship patterns. What is this pattern trying to teach you about your own needs? For connection and autonomy, Jung believed that our relationships mirror our internal psychological state. When someone consistently tells you to do whatever you want, it's worth asking whether some part of you is seeking validation for your independence, even at the cost of genuine connection. The person using this phrase may also be engaging in what Jung called regression, reverting to a less mature psychological state when faced with relationship challenges. Rather than developing the capacity for healthy conflict and negotiation, they retreat to emotional detachment. Ultimately, when someone habitually says, "Do whatever you want" in response to your needs or questions, Jung would advise you to pay attention to this red flag. It signals a fundamental unwillingness to participate in the mutual growth and engagement that healthy relationships require. Rather than seeing this as a gift of freedom, recognize it for what it often is: a withdrawal from the relationship itself. 2. You're not enough for me. The projection of shadow onto others. When someone repeatedly tells you, "You're not enough for me," they're engaging in what Carl Jung would identify as a profound psychological projection. This statement reveals far more about the speaker's internal struggles than it does about your actual worth or capabilities. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents the aspects of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge. Our perceived inadequacies, weaknesses, and darker impulses. When someone claims you're not enough, they're often projecting their own deep-seated feelings of inadequacy onto you. Jung would recognize this as a defense mechanism designed to protect the fragile ego from confronting its own perceived insufficiency. This phrase is particularly damaging because it exploits a universal human fear, the fear of being fundamentally inadequate. Jung observed that we all carry unconscious wounds related to our sense of self-worth. When someone targets this vulnerable area by declaring you not enough, they're activating ancient archetypal fears that resonate in the collective unconscious. This creates a psychological hook that can trap you in a cycle of trying to prove your worth. What makes this statement especially insidious is its vagueness. What exactly does enough mean? The ambiguity is intentional, creating a moving target that ensures you can never actually measure up. Jung would note that this perpetual state of falling short serves the speaker's unconscious need to maintain power in the relationship while avoiding their own internal work. From a Jungian perspective, people who habitually claim others aren't enough are often struggling with what he called inflation, an exaggerated sense of their own importance that compensates for deep insecurity. By positioning themselves as the judge of your worth, they elevate their own psychological position while lowering yours. This phrase often appears in relationships where one person is avoiding the process of individuation, the journey toward psychological wholeness that Jung identified as our primary developmental task. Rather than facing their own incompleteness, they project it outward, making it your problem rather than theirs. The statement reflects what Jung would call anima animus, possession, when unconscious contrasexual aspects of the psyche take over. A person declaring you not enough may be unconsciously seeking an impossible ideal that represents their own undeveloped spiritual or emotional qualities. Jung observed that our relationships often mirror our relationship with ourselves. Someone who consistently finds others not enough is revealing their own inability to accept human limitation and imperfection, both in themselves and others. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what healthy relationships require. The psychological impact of repeatedly hearing you're not enough can be devastating because it attacks the core of your identity. Jung would recognize this as an assault on what he called the self, the organizing center of the entire personality. When your self is under attack, psychological fragmentation can occur. People who use this phrase are often trapped in what Jung called a power complex, an overemphasis on control and superiority that blocks authentic connection. By keeping you in a position of perpetual inadequacy, they avoid the vulnerability required for genuine intimacy. Jung would also identify this as a form of magical thinking, the unconscious belief that by declaring you insufficient, the person can avoid confronting their own fears of attachment and vulnerability. It's easier to find fault with you than to risk the emotional exposure of true connection. This statement is particularly common in relationships where one party has what Jung would call an unresolved parental complex. Their excessive criticism often mirrors childhood experiences of conditional love, where acceptance had to be earned through performance or achievement rather than being freely given. From an archetypal perspective, the person saying, "You're not enough," is often playing out the role of the terrible judge, an internal figure that measures worth based on impossible standards. This archetypal energy, when projected outward, creates relationships characterized by criticism rather than acceptance. Jung observed that our psychological health depends largely on our ability to integrate opposing aspects of our nature. Someone who consistently finds others lacking is often struggling with what he called enantiodromia, the tendency for attitudes to transform into their opposites when pushed to extremes. Their excessive criticism often masks a deep longing for acceptance of their own inadequacies. The phrase, "you're not enough for me," also reflects what Jung would call inflation of the persona, an over-identification with a social mask that prevents authentic engagement. The person may be more concerned with how the relationship appears to others than with its actual emotional substance. This statement represents a fundamental misunderstanding of love from a Jungian perspective. Jung saw love not as a judgment of adequacy, but as a recognition of wholeness that includes both strengths and limitations. When someone consistently judges you as inadequate, they're revealing their own inability to love in this complete sense. Jung would also recognize this pattern as a manifestation of the puer-puella complex, an immature psychological state, characterized by idealization and disappointment rather than realistic engagement with human imperfection. The person may be unconsciously seeking an impossible ideal partner who compensates for their own sense of inadequacy. The psychological toll of remaining in a relationship with someone who consistently finds you not enough can lead to what Jung called a complex, an emotionally charged constellation of thoughts and feelings that can dominate the personality. This not enough complex can persist long after the relationship ends, affecting future connections. From a developmental perspective, Jung would note that this pattern often emerges from what he called conditional love in childhood, the experience of being valued only for meeting external standards rather than for one's inherent worth. The person perpetuating this pattern is often unconsciously recreating their own wounding. This phrase also reveals what Jung would call a power shadow, the unconscious use of criticism to maintain psychological dominance. By keeping you in a state of perpetual inadequacy, the person avoids confronting their own fears of being judged or found wanting. Jung observed that relationships serve as vehicles for psychological growth, but only when both parties engage authentically. Someone who consistently declares you not enough is avoiding this mutual growth process, preferring the false security of judgment over the vulnerability of equal engagement. The statement reflects what Jung would call arrested development, a fixation at an immature psychological stage where relationships are seen in terms of performance rather than connection. This arrested development prevents the natural evolution toward what Jung called conscious relatedness, relationships characterized by mutual respect and acceptance. When you hear, "You're not enough for me," Jung would advise you to recognize it not as a truth about your worth, but as valuable information about the speaker's psychological state. This awareness allows you to step back from the projection rather than internalizing it as your own inadequacy. Jung believed that our most painful relationship patterns contain the seeds of our greatest growth. If you consistently attract people who find you not enough, it may be reflecting an unconscious belief about your own worth that needs healing. The pattern invites you to develop what Jung called self-acceptance, a compassionate recognition of your inherent value beyond external validation. Ultimately, when someone habitually tells you you're not enough for me, Jung would see this as a clear signal to walk away, not because you're actually inadequate, but because the person has revealed their own psychological inability to engage in a healthy, mutually affirming relationship. Their statement says far more about their own unresolved shadow material than it does about your worth or potential. 3. If you really loved me, you'd do what I ask. When someone says, if you really loved me, you'd do what I ask, they're engaging in what Carl Jung would identify as emotional manipulation through conditional love. This phrase weaponizes affection, turning love into a transactional exchange rather than an authentic connection. In Jungian psychology, genuine love stems from what he called unconditional positive regard, acceptance without demands. However, this manipulative statement reveals what Jung would call a power complex, using emotional leverage to control another's behavior. The statement creates what Jung termed a false dilemma: either comply with demands or be labeled as unloving. This phrase operates through the archetypal fear of rejection. Jung observed that humans are fundamentally relational beings with an innate need for connection. By threatening this connection, the manipulator exploits a primal vulnerability. The underlying message is, prove your love through compliance, or I will withdraw mine. From a Jungian perspective, this manipulation often reveals the speaker's own insecurity. Their need to control reflects what Jung called compensation, an attempt to gain externally what they lack internally. Unable to trust in love freely given, they try to secure it through emotional blackmail. Jung would identify this pattern as reflecting an undeveloped anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of the personality that governs relationship capacity. A mature anima animus understands that love thrives through freedom, not coercion. The manipulator's statement reveals their immature concept of relationship, where control substitutes for mutual respect. This manipulation creates what Jung called a hook, an emotional trigger that bypasses rational thought. Even when you recognize the manipulation intellectually, the fear of losing connection can override logical resistance. This is particularly powerful because it targets what Jung identified as our attachment needs, basic psychological requirements for security and belonging. People who consistently use this phrase often demonstrate what Jung termed emotional inflation, an exaggerated sense of entitlement within relationships. They position themselves as the arbiter of love's conditions, placing you in a perpetually subservient position where you must continually prove your affection. The psychological impact of hearing this phrase repeatedly can create what Jung called a complex, an emotionally charged constellation of thoughts that influences behavior. This love-proof complex can persist long after the relationship ends, creating patterns of excessive compliance in future relationships. Jung would note that this manipulation often stems from the speaker's own childhood wounds, perhaps experiences, where love was conditional rather than freely given. However, understanding the origin doesn't diminish its harmful impact. The pattern represents what Jung called unconscious repetition, recreating familiar but unhealthy dynamics. This manipulative phrase reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of love's nature. Jung saw authentic love as enhancing freedom rather than restricting it. When someone tries to leverage love as a control mechanism, they reveal their own inability to participate in the mutual growth that characterizes healthy relationships. The statement also betrays what Jung called shadow projection, attributing one's own negative qualities to others. The manipulator may be unconsciously projecting their own fear of not being loved enough, demanding proof to soothe their own insecurities rather than addressing them directly. Jung would recognize this dynamic as a manifestation of the power archetype gone awry. Rather than expressing power through authentic influence and mutual respect, the manipulator resorts to emotional coercion, a sign of psychological weakness rather than strength. This phrase often serves as what Jung called a psychological bypass, avoiding direct communication about needs and instead using manipulation to achieve compliance. Rather than honestly stating, "I want you to do this," the person wraps the request in emotional blackmail, making it harder to refuse. Jung observed that our relationships reflect our internal psychological state. Someone who repeatedly uses love as leverage is revealing their own insecure attachment style, what Jung might call an unresolved mother complex, where love is something to be earned rather than freely exchanged. The statement creates what Jung termed psychological dissonance, a painful state where you must choose between your authentic self and maintaining connection. This impossible choice represents what Jung called a sacrifice of the self, abandoning your integrity to preserve relationship. When someone habitually says, "If you really loved me, you'd do what I ask," Jung would advise you to recognize it as a clear warning sign. This manipulation reveals a fundamental lack of respect for your autonomy and an inability to engage in healthy relationship dynamics. Walking away isn't just self-protection, it's a recognition that true love cannot thrive where manipulation replaces mutual respect. 4. All my exes were toxic. When someone repeatedly claims, "All my exes were toxic," Jung would immediately recognize this as what he called a projection pattern. This statement reveals a fundamental unwillingness to acknowledge one's own role in relationship dynamics. In Jungian psychology, relationships function as mirrors, reflecting both conscious and unconscious aspects of ourselves. When someone consistently blames all former partners, they're displaying what Jung termed shadow blindness, an inability to recognize their own contributions to relationship failures. The mathematical improbability of every ex being the problem reveals what Jung called unconscious compensation, where the ego protects itself from uncomfortable truths. Rather than confronting personal patterns, the individual creates a narrative where they're perpetually victimized by others. This phrase often indicates what Jung would identify as an unintegrated victim archetype. While everyone experiences legitimate victimization at times, chronically viewing oneself as the innocent party in all relationships reflects psychological rigidity rather than growth. Jung observed that repeated relationship patterns serve as invitations to consciousness. The person who sees only others' toxicity is missing what Jung called the golden shadow, the opportunity to recognize and transform their own participation in dysfunctional dynamics. This statement also reveals what Jung termed magical thinking, the unconscious belief that by labeling all exes as toxic, one is somehow protected from acknowledging painful truths about oneself. This self-deception prevents the individuation process that Jung saw as essential to psychological development. People who habitually blame all former partners often demonstrate what Jung called an inflation-deflation cycle, alternating between grandiose self-perception and crushing unworthiness. By projecting all negativity onto others, they temporarily avoid confronting their own wounded aspects. From a Jungian perspective, this phrase signals an undeveloped capacity for what he called objective self-reflection, the ability to see oneself clearly without excessive self-justification. This blindness creates a pattern where new relationships inevitably recreate old dynamics. When someone declares all their exes toxic, Jung would advise caution. This statement reveals not just a history of failed relationships, but an unconscious commitment to avoiding self-awareness. By walking away from someone with this pattern, you're not judging them, you're recognizing their current psychological limitations for creating healthy partnerships. 5. You have to accept me as I am. When someone insists, you have to accept me as I am, they're invoking what appears to be a reasonable request for authenticity. However, Jung would recognize this statement, when used to deflect all feedback, as resistance to the fundamental human process of psychological development. Jung believed that life's primary purpose is what he called individuation, the ongoing journey towards psychological wholeness. This process requires both self-acceptance and continuous growth. When someone weaponizes "accept me as I am" to reject all change, they're refusing what Jung saw as life's central task. This phrase often masks what Jung termed psychological inflation, an exaggerated sense of completeness that defends against acknowledging areas needing development. Rather than engaging with feedback as an opportunity for growth, the person creates a false dichotomy: either accept everything about them uncritically or reject them entirely. From a Jungian perspective, this statement can reveal the presence of what he called a complex, an emotionally charged psychological pattern that distorts perception. The unchangeable complex leads individuals to confuse their essential self with changeable behaviors, treating all criticism as an existential threat. Jung observed that healthy relationships involve what he called mutual individuation, partners supporting each other's growth while maintaining authenticity. When someone refuses all adaptation, they're signaling an unwillingness to participate in this essential relational process. This phrase often betrays what Jung would identify as shadow projection, attributing one's own rigidity to others. The person demanding unconditional acceptance may be unconsciously projecting their own inability to accept aspects of themselves or others. Jung would recognize this statement as particularly problematic when used to justify harmful behaviors. It represents what he called archetypal possession, where primitive psychological energies override conscious ethical development and the person refuses to integrate higher consciousness into their personality. This stance reflects what Jung termed arrested development, fixation at an immature psychological stage where personal comfort is prioritized over growth. While self-acceptance is vital, Jung emphasized that authentic development always balances acceptance with the responsibility to evolve. When someone consistently uses "you have to accept me as I am" to avoid all personal reflection or growth, Jung would view this as a clear signal to walk away. This refusal indicates a fundamental misalignment with the dynamic nature of healthy relationships. Relationships that, according to Jung, should foster both security and transformation through mutual engagement. If these words resonated with your experience, share in the comments. Which of these phrases have you heard before, and how did you notice the hidden pattern behind it? Your story might illuminate the path for many who are still trapped in these psychological snares that Jung warned us about. Subscribe for more profound insights about human behavior through the Jungian lens.